Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you all joining us today. Thank you so much. So this workshop is titled Environmental Racism, Justice and Sustainability in Education, Empowering Student Advocacy. Welcome. Hope you enjoyed the keynote speakers. I know that I was quite impressed by both of them and left me with a lot of things to think about. So my name is Simcoe Newman, and I am a second year MEd student in social justice education at OISE at the University of Toronto, and very honored to be helping out with this workshop today. So unfortunately, one of the speakers for this workshop was unable to make it, and he sends his regrets. So you will be led today by Matt Webbe, who is a system principal in equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging for the Simcoe County District School Board. And Matt, I will be turning it over to you.
Thank you, Miko. Much appreciated. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'd like to start off by stating that, we're all on a learning journey. And though I'm sharing my insights with you about this topic and how it plays out within the Simcoe County School Board in various ways, I'm no means the expert. We learn and grow from each other, and as such, we all become experts in our respective spaces. So, environmental racism, justice, and sustainability in education, empowering student advocacy. As Amiko mentioned, Superintendent Michael Giffen, who's the Superintendent of Education and Environmental Education, Outdoor Education, and Sustainability for Simcoe County District School Board, is unable to attend. My name is Matthew Webb, and I'm the system-wide or board-wide principal for equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging for Simcoe. So, for our board, in our context, how does environmental racism, justice, sustainability in education, empowering student advocacy align to our strategic priorities? In the sense of well-being, it allows students, similar to what our keynote speaker said earlier today, to have voice and agency and an appreciation for environmental practices and outdoor learning. In terms of trust and accountability, transparency, it aligns quite well with our strategic priority of developing community, purposeful partnerships, lifelong learning. And in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion, the work in this area also reflects the opportunities to have all voices and perspectives heard on various topics that impact student growth and development and academics within our system. And it also, this field of environmental education, environmental justice, anti-racism advocacy work, it also enables students to see a wider range of programs and also additional learning and professional pathways that could be open to them that they never thought of before, that aligns with their interests and their passions. And lastly, we as professionals, those of us in this space that are educators, when we align our work in numerous ways, in transdisciplinary ways, we raise the standards of achievement for all students. We increase a sense of belonging and engagement in learning environments. We expand the understanding that numeracy and literacy is in a variety of areas and a variety of ways. And we also drive the perspective of integrating technologies as need be, whether it's presenting in terms of advocacy work, whether it's discovering a new method in terms of soil reclamation. We allow technology to enhance support and further develop our research area, our passions, our skills, and our advocacy work. So learning goals for today. The point is today is just a basic understanding of the importance of environmental racism and justice and why it's such an important part of social justice education within Ontario schools. To understand and identify the need to integrate environmental racism and justice education into the K-12 curriculum, and how most of us in this space, how do we identify how urban school environments have the predominant instances of environmental injustice within urban settings? It is the urban context sometimes, and sometimes other politically charged areas in rural settings that help students understand the importance of the critical issues related to environmental racism, social justice, environmental justice, sustainability, and advocacy work. So again, because we are learning in this space and sometimes we may share things, I just wanted to quickly cement the thinking behind Singleton and Linton's just an agreement on our conversation. Please stay engaged. We know that we're going to experience some discomfort. This is the space for you to speak your truth of how you see yourself, this topic, your students, your district, your environment, your setting, and how this learning applies to you, or insights or feedback or points to bring up. Accept that we may never come to a full understanding and agreement on what we're discussing together today within the session and as a conversation piece. So there's three particular sections when we start this session. One is just a basic understanding of environmental justice and sustainability. Two, why should Ontario school education systems include a focus on sustainability and societal issues? And finally, how do we empower student advocacy through this lens in our respective spaces? So understanding environmental justice, sustainability. For some of you, this is probably a definition you're already aware of, and for some of you, it's not. So I just thought, let's just center this based on what we define as environmental racism for the purposes of this session. So environmental racism is a concept from the environmental justice movement that looks into the different policies, practices, interrelationships, and practices that discriminate communities that are mainly Black, Indigenous, and inclusive of other peoples of color. Sometimes these communities have to live near landfills, sewage plants, other toxic facilities, and other detrimental environment conditions. But really, we also look at through environmental racism, the economic inequalities due to class, due to race, due to religion, due to historical legacy practices, and how they've been created between urban and rural settings. So when we think of what is environmental justice and sustainability education, we have to always remember that they're actually not separate. They're intertwined in important ways. And because of how they're intertwined, how we as educators intertwine them is where we offer the most education for our students. And so I wanted to engage into a dialogue after this quick video. And again, Amika, I'm going to ask you to moderate the chat if I miss anything, if you don't mind. Thank you. Though this example is from America and from Greenpeace, the story of Melinda Tillies, who lives in Youngsville, is very telling as to how racialized people, marginalized peoples see and define environmental justice and the issues that impact them. And so that the issues of racism, environment, and socioeconomic justice are also tied into the overall arching notion of environmental justice.
Almost a month ago, when they really started, like the 18-wheelers started coming in and like bringing these big poles, it woke us up out of a deep sleep. Yes, it really did. Feel like we were like in California with a earthquake and everything, We live in Youngsville, Louisiana. It's very quiet. Everybody watches out for everyone. We bought this house last year in 2017. And when I first came here, I loved it. Oh, I got my own home. I was excited. I'm trying to preserve this home for my kids, my grandkids, and with them, don't look like they're gonna last very long. I don't want my house to collapse. This is my dream home, and they tearing it up. But it's just all the shaking and my lights flickering now. The baseboard is coming loose. When I open up my doors, it's nothing but big bobcat machines digging, and that's like every day. I'm gonna fight them until this crap is gone. I mean, take your pipes, load them on your truck, and just go, please. They just messing up our Youngsville. No one came with no papers or nothing for us to, even let us know what was going on. See, this is all the chaos, the mess. I don't know what you call this thing here, but when they dropped it, my house shook so hard, I ran outside. My property line is like right in here, right here. What a little stick is sticking up at, I made sure I put that there so they wouldn't come on my property. I hope everybody's hearing this. This is the bottom of the list company. They do have spills, and I'm just praying, you know, because we have well water and stuff. We have to drink that, and we don't want to get sick. People need to know what's really going on with this. Everybody needs to protest against it because it's not right. My sign says, "Get the hell away from my house." I wanted to say, "Get the beep from my house." I'm gonna fight till I can't fight anymore, you know, but they're not gonna run me out of my house. They're not. They're not getting my property. They just need to take their pipes and go. For real.
So, how does Melinda's situation allate the complexities of racism and socioeconomic justice? Perspectives, thoughts?
Can you please elaborate a little bit more on that question?
Sure, no problem. Is it Cecilia?
Clelia.
Clelia, no problem. So what I'm asking the group is, based upon this video, what are the complex issues of racism and socioeconomic justice that could be seen or heard that we can engage in a conversation with our students?
Oh, okay, I see. Thank you.
So I'll bring up an interesting point here. It's interesting how the community has been aware socially about the impact that this particular corporation has had its history in terms of doing its work. And notice what she said, how she also talked about how they really had no notice. So what does that tell you about this, about the social structure within that region of Louisiana?
I'll just read out a few comments from the chat that are coming up. So one person was saying that this video is also reminiscent of the construction of pipelines that's happening in British Columbia on Indigenous lands. Another person mentioned that there was a lack of consultation, and they asked, would this have happened in a white neighborhood? I think that's a wonderful question.
Yes.
Another comment is that we can look at which communities were being selected for this pipeline to go through, noticing that they're predominantly Black. There's a hierarchy of power taking place. Wow, okay, a lot of great comments coming in on the chat here. So someone's suggesting that we ask students to be thinking about whose land the pipeline goes through, whose it doesn't, and why. And then others just saying that there's a significant lack of political voice, lack of consultation, no notice provided, white supremacy.
Yes. And so the reason why thank you, Emiko. The reason why I asked that that particular question, Cecilia, was because I wanted us to think of ways in which we could use this video to not only talk about the environmental issues, but also to talk about the connection. That's why the heading of the slide, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Conversation Jumpstart. Because as I mentioned earlier at the start of this session, it's so important that our students recognize that when it comes to environmental justice, environmental racism, sustainability, and I think that I said the key word was that it's so intertwined. And so how do we use this as a launching pad in our grade 9 science class, or as we're integrating it for grade 7 or 8 in the science curriculum? How can we now go further and talk about the issues of oppression, race, politics, policies? So thank you for sharing, all of you. So as I mentioned before, and I kind of already cemented this already, environmental justice is rooted in complex issues that affect our most marginalized peoples and communities. And there's a lot of research out there now about the importance that we really look at the science curriculum now, and we talk about really succinctly teaching through the lens of geoscience, and how geoscience really encompasses environmental education, science, politics, etc. And we should maybe consider that as another science strand within the science curriculum in Ontario. So there's a lot of research coming that way, that it's so important that we really address the issues of environmental justice in education, within education, by maybe making it distinct within the science curriculum going forward. And so how do we make the issues of environmental justice and racism connect to sustainability? As Canadian and global issues related to sustainability affect everybody around the world, no one's left untouched. But when we incorporate topics such as, and here's the connection, how it goes deeper, such as risk and resilience in the face of hazards, and the geoethics, it allows students to really look and incorporate environmental justice into how that impacts the sociology and psychological aspects of sustainability. How do these actions impact the mental health and well-being of individuals like Melinda? And this next clip, which is an excellent one that I found, that talks about, for our students in our classrooms today who are learning about anti-Black racism more so than they've ever done before through social media, how could you make that connection for students about environmentalism and Black Lives Matter? And as we move further on into this session, there is also a historical connection to the early work of environmentalism within Canada through the lens of indigeneity and Black history in parts of Nova Scotia.
The phrase, "I can't breathe," just means so much. There are people who are living in environments where they literally cannot breathe properly because of the air quality. We currently are living through a pandemic that's making it even harder for those same people to be able to literally breathe, and then also to be threatened by police officers and to be killed and not be able to breathe again. It just needs to stop. Hi, I'm Leah Thomas, and I'm an environmental communications specialist and a blogger. When you look at the data and you see where most of the environmental injustices are happening, you're going to find that it's mostly not happening in white communities. In some instances, it is, like fracking mountain communities, but the majority of it is happening in inner cities or sometimes even rural Black and brown communities and Indigenous communities. COVID is highlighting those environmental injustices even more, because in so many communities, Black and brown people live in areas of terrible air pollution and air quality, and children are experiencing higher rates of asthma. It's just terrible. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and I went to school in Orange County. I decided I wanted to declare my major as environmental science, and unfortunately during that time, that's when there was a shooting of Michael Brown. He was an unarmed Black boy who was shot multiple times by a police officer, and that happened about 10 minutes from my house. It was really traumatizing. His body was laying in the street for 4 hours, and my sister participated in the protest, was tear gassed, her friends were tear gassed, things were burning to the ground, and then I had to go back to school, had to go back to California, but I couldn't really focus because my town back home was literally falling apart, and I was really coming to terms with my identity as a Black person in America. And when I was in my classes, I kept learning about protecting nature and how healing it could be, and I found it to be so healing for myself. I was in Southern California, I'm in the mountains, I'm going to the beach, but I just felt so bad for everyone back home that was literally drowning in the smoke of tear gas and fires. And that's when I really got interested in environmental justice, just wishing that people, like the people in the community of Ferguson, could have access to the same thing I had access to be able to find healing in nature and to have a safe environment. I was having a lot of feelings that I wasn't understanding because the conversations weren't going on about intersectional environmentalism. And when I would raise my hand and say, what about Flint? Or what about all these people that are living without access to healthy organic produce? What about them? It was silenced a lot of the time, or it just was considered like an add-on or something extra. When I was reading about advocating for public lands and saving all of these endangered species, I just kind of wish I would have had the courage to stand up and say, okay, there are all these endangered species, but Black people are also endangered in this country right now, and that's something that's equally as important. After witnessing everything that's been happening this week, I just felt like I really needed to say something and really wanted to encourage environmentalists that I've stood alongside in climate protests to stand alongside me and all the Black people in America right now. I wasn't hearing a lot about it from the environmental community and was kind of disappointed. So I made a post very specifically in this moment to say Black Lives Matter, because sometimes people seem a little hesitant to just say the word Black. And I was just trying my hardest to put on paper how I was feeling about the type of environmentalism that I want to see. And I want to see environmentalism that's inclusive of all people and environmentalism that stands for Black lives. I posted it. I thought I was gonna get like fired and that people maybe weren't gonna be super excited about it, but that definitely wasn't the case. And I was just really surprised, and the best way to see so many environmentalists jump on board, so many companies and organizations that I really look up to share that message. And it seems like it's clicking with more people that if environmentalism isn't inclusive and intersectional, then it doesn't really stand for justice at all in the first place. Intersectional environmentalism is an inclusive version of environmentalism because it's looking at the degradation of both the planet and also the poor treatment of people and their relationship to the planet. And I think we need to focus on people, because when we're talking about the climate crisis, the people who are currently facing the harshest impacts of climate change are people of color. A lot of the times I'm the only Black person in some of these environmental organizations, and I might be the only person that's raising awareness for it, and it's a lot easier for it to be silenced. But if more people in the environmental movement could be allies to these causes, I think it would be talked about even more. And I wish people would start doing that. It's not really about my post. I'm really happy that people are sharing it, but I just hope that people take the time to really learn about everything that's happening and just take the time to dive into the inequities. Everyone has a place in the environmental movement and in social justice movements. Not everybody is going to be the person that holds a megaphone, but you can also share content online that an environmental activist is posting, talk about it with your friends and family, and find a way to get involved, because it really is going to take all of us to solve this. The phrase, I can't breathe, just...
And any thoughts before I continue the discussion on this particular topic, the intersectionality of environmentalism? It's so important. May I just see a quick raise of hands? And Miko, can I just ask you to do a visual count for me? How many of our participants in this session today are urban educators, meaning you live within the GTA and you teach within the GTA? Quick raise of hands.
So if you can all go to the reaction button on the bottom and press raise hand, then I can get a sense of this. That would be great.
Okay.
I cannot find mine, but my hand is also raised.
Thank you. It looks like we're at about 11 people, 11 or 12.
11 out of, okay, almost half. Okay. And so the reason why I asked that question critically is because it's so important that when I was a principal in the Toronto District School Board last year, and my school was in Parkdale, Queen Victoria Public School, I made it a concerted effort to encourage my junior intermediate teachers to bring in environmental justice, environmental racism, sustainability into their science, literacy, numeracy programs. And I said to them that we're in a community, those of you that are familiar with Parkdale, we're near the CNE, Canadian National Exhibition. it's mainly apartments. My students own, like, there's very little green space within the immediate community. And I said to my staff at the time, the great staff, I said, how do we educate our students about the world beyond Jameson and King? We need to make our students understand and know that they too can be environmentalists, even if they live in an apartment. And just similar to what Leah had mentioned in the video here, you know, it started off with her understanding the basics and learning how to connect to the environment and appreciate the environment. So I encourage my staff, take the kids down to Lakeshore Boulevard, take them along, walk them through CNE towards former Ontario Place, let them explore their neighborhood beyond the apartment blocks and the Victorian houses within Parkdale. The reason for that is a lot of my students, both parents work, or they have limited access to enjoy being that close to Lake Ontario. And from that stemmed and developed an environmental, we called it like a green team, we called it at the school, that actually started to really promote and look at how environmental racism and injustices affect marginalized peoples from around the world. And we had a student of South Asian heritage that talked about, it's interesting how, and they looked at where the country of their parents' origin, and they looked at India. And the student said to me, Mix Webb, you know, and I said, yes. And the student said, you know, I don't understand. We talk about here in Canada how environmental racism impacts the poorest people, the poorest racialized peoples across Canada and the United States. And the student said, and I come from a country, India, where there is a lot of poverty, and who speaks for those people? And gave me examples of, you know, the pollution along the River Ganges and other things that are happening. And I said, you're right. And then the student said, and I showed them this clip, and the student said, you know what, I want to become an environmental warrior or activist. And I like to go back to my parents' country and correct that. And I thought, wow, that was powerful that this student saw this video and re-saw themselves and saw themselves now in a field and a pathway that they didn't see before. And how this connects to sustainability, it's similar to what Leah said, you know, as she experiences what was happening at home. And it's interesting how environmental racism and justice is looked at in different ways. You know, she alludes to the connection of being in her hometown and seeing and observing the protests, the violence, the harm. That is a form of environmental racism. When we talk about policing and racialized peoples, indigenous peoples being, that is a form of environmental racism. Looking at the structure and barriers of institutions upon communities. So it's also important, back to that intersectionality piece, that students not only see it as the physical environment, access to tree, water, nature, good quality of air, but sometimes the impact of peoples coming into a community space and impacting those that live in that space and how they may have caused harm or create further barriers is another lens to environmental racism and justice. Any thoughts? Because I think that was pretty deep with only one cup of coffee. Any thoughts on that?
You're bringing me back, and my heart is racing. So I have a lot of thoughts, and also I have a lot of feelings that I'm just gonna sit with my cup of coffee. Thank you.
Thank you. No problem. I appreciate you acknowledging that. And again, my lived experience of being at that school last year as the principal before I moved to this board, Simcoe, was my experience, and others. And that's not to say India is not the only country in the world that has similar dynamics. I just want to put that out there in this space. There are many, many second and third world countries that are in that position where the populace is poorer than the affluent class, and how politics and race, classism, and economics drives hardship and environmental racism, social environmental injustices to populace. So I've given you a perspective in terms of a Black lived experience. And again, another interesting thing that we will learn when we talk about student advocacy and agency, when we get there, and to be frank with you, we're not going to get to the end of my session because I didn't expect it to be this deep, this quick. But I will be happy to share the slide deck with all of you, and you're free to use it for professional purposes. Just please give myself and Superintendent Giffen credit where need be. But I really want us to also talk about the fact of there's not a lot of Canadian content. And that's a very interesting thing. I've presented many times for OISE over the years. And I also took the environmental education AQ part 1, which I adored and really spurred my passion, thanks to Hillary and Bob teaching the AQ many years ago. But there's not a lot of Canadian content about environmental racism, which is a shame. And that's one area I think we need to really, I refuse to believe it doesn't exist. It exists. So why are we not hearing the stories? Why aren't we not having the research? We hear about the larger pieces, the larger items, and I'm going to qualify this, if they hit the media. But I refuse to believe that it's not happening in Canada, especially with our colonial settlerism history that's been nuanced and has impacted many, many newcomers and many Indigenous peoples and many peoples who are native to this land. And I mean native in the respective term. So I'm going to share with you an example of a discussion that happened at York University recently about what does Indigenous environmental justice looks like, because it's a very different perspective. And as I prompt you with that thinking, I would like you to listen to the professor York as she talks about, and she also speaks with a community elder. But before we go on to that, I also want to show you the point from a Toronto lens. I used this slide in a presentation for the Econ conference earlier this year. I pulled up some information from the city, and this is available from the City of Toronto website, of the neighborhoods that have been impacted by COVID. And I thought I wanted to include this after Leah's video clip, because I thought it's important from a Canadian context that look at the communities. Really look at the communities that are hardest hit with COVID. Morningside Heights, Malvern, Kingston Road in Galloway, Scarborough, 401 Bathurst and Dufferin and Lawrence West, not affectionately known as the Jungle, Rexdale, Jane and Finch and Steeles. Where's a little sliver of Parkdale? It's so interesting, similar to what Leah said, that the communities hardest hit when it comes to environmental issues are communities that have a large racialized community. So I just wanted to put that into a local context before we move on. So, what is Indigenous environmental injustice? And we're going to have a very brief discussion about in what ways could you integrate this into your teaching and learning.
I was born and raised on the land. The land raised me for the first 15 years. I lived in the bush, and we had to move when I was 15 because the government made the forest into a provincial forest. So that's my first experience of injustice in regards to land.
At first, I didn't really connect with the environment because I'm from a very polluted place with 40% of Canada's petrochemical industry. And so I didn't connect with that at all. I saw granite and rocks all in big piles next to the water that would be taken off in ships to different places to make like roads and to be sold. And so that's how I would see where rocks would come from. And then I would see the big smokestacks in my community, and I would think that's how clouds are made. And so I got very confused at a young age when I was in grade 5 and My teacher was talking about how clouds are made and how the water system works. And I didn't believe her because I thought they were actually made in my backyard.
One thing that concerns me is the pipelines that are being put under the lakes. Like, that concerns me because, like, what if it pops or busts in? And that's already happened to a couple of them.
I don't think people have a clue about what the government accepts as, you know, safe, or what those companies, those fracking companies or energy, any kind of development company can do, you know, with the wastes and how they clean that up.
An image that's used a lot where you see kids playing baseball and a giant refinery in the back around, and that's what we grew up knowing. That was actually where my daycare was, and then we moved the daycare to the middle of the reserve because we thought it would be safer. So I was that generation that was there and then was moved, and so that's half of where I spent my daycare time, and taking my puffer and practicing like spills, like in case a spill happens, what to do, or like just like a fire drill, pretty much.
You have to stop coming on to Indigenous communities, assuming that you're allowed to take resources right from under people. That is a grave injustice, because all that we've seen is that this system, the colonial system, has been getting rich off the lands of Indigenous people and leaving Indigenous people on lands that they have literally destroyed. The environment is suffering. We have, you know, these oil companies that come on our communities and extract and leave the communities with poison water. Mining companies, they leave poison water, they leave destruction in their path, and they don't clean up, they don't fix anything, and they have gained so much money from doing this that they've used that money in an abusive way.
Being from a poor neighborhood, or being in an Indigenous community, or being from an immigrant community might be a reason why they think it's okay to put a refinery beside your house, because you don't have as big a voice.
So in what way, outside of the more notable social studies history curriculum, could this be used to integrate into your teaching and learning with your students, your community, or as knowledge sharing? Sorry, Amiko, I can't see the chats, because if I click, everyone will see all the chats. I believe there's.
Yeah, I can read out what people
Thank
are
you.
writing. So one person is saying in literacy, around media literacy skills. Everyone's probably just taking a moment to think about this.
No problem. I also see this as a tool for understanding how advocacy works. How do you, and as a launching pad to student voice, right? Because some students, depending on their lived experiences in our classrooms and our spaces in schools, different institutions, may be aware of Autumn Pelletier's advocacy work in this area. So there's that connection of, you know, environmental justice work, environmental advocacy work for students doesn't have to be after you've had a formal education in that area and that nuance. So that's another good launching pad of who is Autumn, or who are some of these people, and how do they get involved in environmental justice or challenging environmental injustice. And what it also does, it also shows our students, breaks down some biases and stereotypes about the perspectives of indigeneity and the community's history in challenging the government. What student can now see this video and now say, oh, but that's not what I was told. That's not what I was taught at home. Oh, that's not what I read in a book. Now you can challenge in a respectful way as an educator, that thinking, that deepening. Would you challenge the government, or would you stand up if your local water near our school wasn't good? So what makes it being Indigenous wrong? Right? And then you can go into that media. Someone mentioned earlier about media literacy. They could talk about the image of how indigeneity advocacy is seen through a biased lens in the media. So just as one clip, you can delve into so many areas. And also for some communities whom we serve or we worked within in inner city types of communities, we can talk about how empowering our parents to learn from our Indigenous peoples how to advocate, how to organize, how to mobilize. And also we could teach that skill to our students who have an interest and passion towards environmental racism, injustice, etc.
There are a few other comments that have come in, Matt. People are drawing connections to social studies, to math, statistics, economics as well. But then also people are bringing up the idea that everything is connected, everything is interdisciplinary. And so we can be linking these sorts of topics to all our subjects.
Yes. All right. Thank you. So an amazing slide that I came across when I was at a conference in the States 2 years ago. And it really highlights for our students or for ourselves visually, the interconnectivity between all these themes and how it sort of allows us to question, and is sustainability at the center, right? We are challenging, social welfare and political and economic policies and processes. We are advocating for change through social justice, equity, through an environmental justice lens to talk and address the conflict. We are from the notion of trying to protect the environment, the resources. We talk about alternate ways to not eliminate economic progress, but how do we do that with an efficient but moral imperative and a moral lens about navigating the environmental resources and the needs for the economy. So when we think about some current examples of these issues, I think of one in terms of where I live in Simcoe County. They're going to be building a highway, an extension from the 404 going over to the 400. And it's called, and you feel free to Google it, it's called the Bradford Bypass. And that has been a very controversial issue since I lived up in Alcona here, south of Barrie, for the last 3 years. And so in my role as principal of equity, my goal is to work with Superintendent Geffen, which is why we were doing this together, about how do we start environmental education and environmental and looking at environmental racism and injustices through that lens, specifically to my superintendent's family of schools, the Bradford area, and having the students look about the advocacy work that's going on, the impact to the water table, the impact to the air pollution. And ironically enough, and I'm going to ask Hillary this, and she's here, because I like to hear some voices in the background. Where do you think that bypass is being placed? Who do you think that bypass would initially impact? And that's the reason why I'm asking you, Hillary, to guess.
It's funny you should say that, because I just saw the map for it yesterday, Matt.
Yes.
And it's running north of the city of Toronto, right? And not only is it running through prime farmland, but I'm going to guess it's also going to run through communities of people who can't afford to live in Toronto. So these are people who might be a little bit more economically challenged. And these might relate to people who are marginalized by race as well. I don't know about the last one for sure, but I'm going to guess about the economically challenged people for sure.
Yes, and interesting enough, and thank you, Hillary. You've exactly addressed the indicators and the pieces I wanted to bring out in this conversation, which is those pieces. So thank you for that. And the interesting part is, again, Bradford is where my superintendent, who I'm attached to, Mr. Superintendent Maltby's area is Bradford. Those schools. It is the largest growing sector in Simcoe County School Board. And where this highway is being built is at the north end of Bradford, as Hillary mentioned, but that's where all the growth is going. So you have individuals who are in maybe Toronto, Mississauga, Brampton, Durham, etc., who have struggled and saved up, is putting down payments on their home, buying these new homes, their first homes for most people, and they're at the northern end of the town, and that is where the highway's going. So can you imagine these people, these families, thinking, oh, wow, I originally drove up to Bradford 2 years ago, put a down payment down. Oh, look at all the grass, the hills. How many of them are really aware that the highway is going to be just north of the new school, of the new potential high school, of their subdivision? And so those communities would be getting that residual pollution of various sorts, potentially coming down into where they're raising their families. But wait a second. The intention was to leave the hustle and bustle congestivity of Toronto to come to get affordable housing and for my children to have a 40-foot backyard to play in. So the question is, what are those developers doing and or communicating to those potential home buyers, knowing that this is going into that part of the town? So food for thought. Any other comments before we move on? I know we have limited time, but I just wanted that to resonate with all of us here for a moment.
Matt, is Bradford, if I'm remembering correctly, is really close to the Holland Marsh too, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So the south part of Bradford is the Holland Marsh.
Yeah, so that's such an important, I mean, it's important not only for more than human forms of life. So there's another element to the eco-justice conversation, but it's also really important for where we get our food from in the GTA. So if they're adding a greater amount of pollutants and potentially destroying some of that land, that's hugely problematic.
Yes, and ironically enough, Hillary, just north of that was just announced this week in our hometown. My husband and I were talking about that. We're getting a brand new hospital. The Royal Victoria Hospital is building a southern campus in my town or outside my town in Alcona, which is also not too far from that highway. So I just think that's also very interesting. How is the Ministry of Health not looking what the Ministry of Transportation is approving and doing when deciding on where to locate the southern campus of a hospital? So things that make you go, And that being said, I want to honor everyone's time, and I apologize humbly to the conference coordinators. We are not through the presentation, but I did agree, Hillary, that I would share the entire slides with the organization, with the host, so that the attendees will see where this was eventually going to be going.
And that's so appreciated. Thank you, Matt. That's fantastic.
So we're going to address on two quick things before we wrap up this session, and I appreciate your willingness and your engagement through the chat feature. So when we look at environmental inequality, racism, and justice, we always have to consider those pieces. And again, thank you, Hillary, for your verbal commentary. The class, the race, the gender, urban versus rural, and what's the key. And, you know, there's an article within another research article where Adderton, I don't know if everyone has read very much, talks about that, you know, we need to be looking and being prepared for the struggles in this area. But we have to, but we have to be making sure that what we're reading is not done through a biased lens, because oftentimes in the reality of how our advocacy work in this field comes about, who has more of the power and influence due to their the nature of their business to spin information. So it's so critical that we teach our children, our students whom we're serving, how to critically look at the information that corporations are putting out about their environmentalism work, about what they claim to be, how they are remediating when they're going into communities, such as what's mentioned with the York University clip about Indigenous environmental injustice. And so it's always important that we also teach our students how to critically look at environmental issues within the context of media and different media platforms through a very critical lens. Adiron also talks about, the highest percentages of minority and disadvantaged persons living near industrialized areas might reflect the pattern of inequity inherent in the structure and pattern growth of urban areas. And that again goes back to the example we talked about the Bradford bypass. So our next session was going to be about why should Ontario education include a focus on sustainability and societal issues? And we're going to conclude with this section because it's so important that some may not be aware, but we do have ministry scopes and sequences and guidelines that support and enhance that it should be included into the curricula in different ways. This should be no different than how we embed literacy and social sciences, how we embed phys ed into mathematics. And it's so important that when you're having those courageous conversations with your school administrators, those that are, I wouldn't say resistant to environmental education in schools, maybe I'm going to qualify this for those because they are my colleagues, may not have a deeper understanding of the power of the interconnectivity and the transdisciplinary benefits of embedding environmental education into the curricula. And as we discussed earlier, the amount of careers and pathways that come from this and interconnectivity that this generation will be exposed to. It's so important that we do embed that. So these are some very powerful documents that are good tools to engage in conversations with your local school team. When you look at your school improvement plan, hey, we have a social studies unit coming up on Indigenous peoples of the 1700s to the grade 7 curriculum. Let's look at what was environmental education like when people came from France and England and settled in Canada. What did that look like? And then you make the connection to students. Let's look at those areas today. Oh, wait, that's Quebec and Ontario. What has changed? What has not? So now you brought further awareness to students that environmental education also existed back when Canada was being first settled. So it's those deepening connections that really bring about a deep schema for our students and how they engage. And we need to make sure that our students proudly see that environmental education, sustainability, and addressing societal issues is also a pathway. It should never be downplayed as a hobby, a passion. There are many, many, many careers in environmental education. You don't see glitzy television shows that highlight that, but there's so many powerful think tanks and organizations, governmental agencies, post-secondary institutions that have a developing and growing environmental education departments, careers, advocacy work, consultancy work. So it's important that our students see that this career or this area is just as equal as mathematics, science, or any other area. So on that note, I'm going to stop here. We're at the halfway point. And again, I'm happy to share the rest of this, and I'll turn this over to Nico.
Matt, I can't tell you how refreshing it is to hear a senior leader in a school board talk about how this should be on the same par as literacy and numeracy. Thank you.
No problem, Hillary.
Yes, thank you so much, Webbe. This was a really just eye-opening and an informative presentation. I really appreciate how you started off with the American context and sharing that video by Leah Thomas with intersectional environmentalism, but then you transitioned it to the Canadian context and really talked about what's going on right here at home. And I do agree with some people who mentioned in the chat that it's so important for students to be realizing that these issues aren't just happening over there, but really all around us here in Canada as well. So thank you very much. I'm so honored that I was able to help you out with this presentation today. And thank you to all of our participants. We really appreciate all of your contributions in the chat. It was wonderful to hear your voices. And I will just give everybody a reminder that the next sessions will be starting at 11:30. So you have a 15-minute break until then. And so thank you, Webbe. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, everyone.